In the heart of the valley during the Great Thaw of 1848, two cabins stood as a testament to two opposing philosophies. The first, belonging to a man named Reuben, was an island of misery in a churning sea of mud. Its log foundations, once set firmly on the winter-hardened ground, now sank unevenly into a brown, soupy quagmire. Water seeped through the floorboards, chilling the air within. Outside, his woodpile was a submerged ruin, each log a dark shape beneath a skin of freezing water. Reuben was a prisoner in his own home, cut off from food, fuel, and solid ground. Less than 100 yards away stood the second cabin. It belonged to Hiram. It rested on a small, miraculously dry patch of earth, a square of stability in a world gone liquid. A steady plume of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a confident signal of warmth and life. Near the cabin, a heavy slanted wooden door sat flush with the ground, its edges clean and unburdened by mud. Hiram's world was dry, warm, and orderly, an impossible paradox in the face of the valley's universal springtime collapse. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories of quiet, forgotten genius resonate with you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. The difference between those two homes was not luck. It was the result of a ghost, an obsession, and a hole in the ground filled with rock. To understand the dry island where Hiram lived, one had to look back 2 years to a different thaw, one that had been less severe but infinitely more cruel. It was the thaw that had taken his wife, Mary. She had fallen ill in late February, a deep, rattling cough that quickly bloomed into a fever. It was a common enough affliction, one that usually yielded to rest, hot liquids, and a relentlessly stoked fire that could sweat the sickness out. But that year, the world outside their cabin had dissolved. A sudden warm wind, what the old-timers called a chinook, had descended upon the valley. The 4 feet of snow that had blanketed the landscape for months turned to slush and then to water in the space of a single day. The frozen ground, still solid a foot below the surface, could not absorb the deluge. Water ran in sheets, pooling in every depression, turning the rich valley soil into a deep, grasping bog. The problem was not the water itself, but the failure of everything it touched. Their cabin, built according to the wisdom of the time, sat on level ground. Now that level ground was a shallow lake. Water wicked up the base logs, and a chilling dampness permeated the small room, fighting the heat from the hearth. Their root cellar, a simple pit dug beneath the floorboards with a trapdoor for access, had become a cistern. Hiram had lifted the door to find their winter stores, potatoes, carrots, smoked hams, floating in murky, foul-smelling water, utterly ruined. But the most catastrophic failure, the one that sealed Mary's fate, was the woodpile. He had stacked it, as all men did, close to the cabin for easy access during the deep snows of winter. It sat on the bare ground, a neat rectangle of split pine and oak. Now the path to it was a treacherous swamp of boot-stealing mud. The bottom 2 rows of the woodpile itself had sunk into the mire and were soaked through. Every trip to fetch fuel was a grueling battle. He would slog through the freezing muck, his legs aching with the strain and the cold, and pull logs from the higher, drier section of the stack. But each piece was coated in a film of icy water, and when he brought it inside, it hissed and steamed, consuming more energy from the fire than it contributed. The fire dwindled. It was impossible to get it hot enough. The cabin grew colder, the dampness more profound. Mary's breathing became a shallow rasp, and the fever, which should have been broken by a powerful radiating heat, instead consumed her. Hiram sat beside her, feeding the sullen, sputtering fire with damp wood, feeling the chill seep up from the floor, a helpless observer to a preventable catastrophe. She died on the 3rd day of the thaw, not from the sickness alone, but from the systemic collapse of their world. The dampness had given her illness a fatal advantage. In the silent, cold days that followed, grief gave way to a cold, analytical rage. Hiram looked at his home not as a place of tragedy, but as a piece of failed engineering. Every man in the valley accepted the spring thaw as a period of unavoidable misery. They called it the mud season, a trial to be endured. They complained, they cursed, but they accepted it as a condition of life, like black flies in June or the brutal cold of January. They saw it as fate. Hiram now saw it as a flaw in design. It was not an act of God. It was a failure of foresight. The problem was not the water. The problem was the universal, unthinking assumption that one could simply build on top of the earth and expect it to behave. He realized, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that you could not fight the water. You had to tell it where to go. This singular thought consumed him. It became an obsession that crowded out all other concerns. The grief for Mary did not vanish, but it was channeled, transformed from a passive ache into an active, driving force. He began to neglect his trapping lines, the primary source of his livelihood. Instead of checking snares and deadfalls, he spent his days walking the contours of his land, his eyes fixed on the ground. He watched how a small rivulet of meltwater carved a path around a large stone. He noted how water pooled in clay-heavy soil but seemed to vanish into sandy loam. He dug test pits, examining the layers of earth, feeling the texture of the soil, seeing how deep the frost penetrated. Yes, his neighbors, Reuben chief among them, watched with suspicion. They saw a man undone by grief, staring at dirt and kicking at rocks. The loss of his Mary has turned his mind, Reuben said to others at the trading post. He wanders his own property like a stranger, looking for answers in the mud. They left him alone, a wide berth of pity and misunderstanding isolating Hiram on his own land. He did not notice their whispers or their worried glances. He was no longer a trapper or a neighbor. He was a student of a single elemental force. His study soon outgrew his own property. He needed more data. Leaving his cabin in the care of no one, he set out on a journey, not for pelts or trade, but for information. He traveled to other settlements, some a week's walk away. At each one, he saw the same story written in the landscape. He saw cabins with dark water stains rising 2 feet up their base logs. He saw the telltale depressions in the earth where collapsed root cellars had been filled in. He talked to the settlers, asking not about their families or their hunting, but about the thaw. How deep does the mud get here, he would ask. Where does the water settle longest? They answered his strange questions with a shrug. To them, it was like asking how hot the summer sun was. It just was. But Hiram cataloged their answers, creating a mental map of systemic failure. He confirmed his hypothesis. The problem was universal. Everyone was living on a flawed design, accepting a yearly disaster as normal. On his journey, he sought out people who worked with the earth, not just on it. He spent 2 days with miners who were sinking a shaft for a rumored silver deposit. He watched them timber their tunnels and, most importantly, how they managed the constant ingress of groundwater. They didn't try to plug the leaks. They dug a sump at the lowest point and bailed it out, or cut a drainage channel that let the water flow harmlessly away. His travels eventually led him to the site of a new territorial fort being constructed, a massive undertaking of stone and timber. There, he found his catalyst. His name was Master Wallace, an old, grizzled stonemason from the east, brought in for his expertise in laying foundations. Hiram watched him for a full day, observing how he and his crew were not building a wall directly against the excavated earth. Instead, they were digging a wide trench, deeper than the foundation itself, and lining it with a carefully graded layer of rocks. Hiram finally approached the old man that evening, sharing a bit of bread and dried meat. He didn't ask about the fort's walls or its bastions. He asked about the trench. Master Wallace, pleased by the unusual and intelligent question, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. That's the important part. More important than the wall in some ways. He explained that the earth was full of water, always moving, always seeking the lowest point. A solid wall, he said, was just a dam. Sooner or later, the water would build up behind it, push, and win. The old mason picked up a handful of small stones. You don't stop the water, son, he said, letting the pebbles trickle through his fingers. That's a fool's errand. You give it an easier path to travel, a path away from what you want to keep dry. This trench, filled with rock, is a road for the water. It will flow into this ditch and follow it downhill, away from our foundation. The wall will only ever have to fight the dry earth. It was the key. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Not a barrier, but a channel. Not a wall, but a road. A path of least resistance. The miners, the beavers he had watched building their dams, and now the stonemason. They all understood the principle. You did not defeat a force like water. You redirected it. You guided it. You made its own nature work for you. The concept of the French drain, An idea ancient in the old world but utterly alien on this frontier crystallized in Hiram's mind. He thanked Master Wallace, his mind already racing. He turned for home the next morning, his step quick and sure. The vague obsession had now solidified into a concrete, actionable plan. He stopped at the main trading post on his way back, but not for traps or ammunition. He purchased a heavy, wide-bladed spade, a new head for his pickaxe, a sturdy wheelbarrow with an iron-banded wheel, and several lengths of quality rope. The quartermaster raised an eyebrow at the order. It was the tool set of a builder, a digger, not a trapper. When Hiram arrived back at his property, he found a young man waiting for him. He was hardly more than a boy, perhaps 17, thin and wiry with an air of quiet desperation. His name was Seth. His father, a hunter, had been killed in a fall, and his mother had succumbed to sickness weeks later. He was alone, with no skills to trade and no family to take him in. He had heard Hiram was back and had come to offer his labor in exchange for food and a place to sleep. Looking at the boy's determined face, Hiram saw not a burden, but an ally. The work ahead was immense, and 2 pairs of hands would be better than 1. "You can stay," Hiram said simply. "The work will be hard, and it will be strange." The next morning, the work began. It was a project of immense and seemingly nonsensical labor. Hiram did not start by felling trees for a new cabin or clearing a new field for planting. He handed Seth a shovel, took up his own pickaxe, and began to dig. His chosen spot was a slight rise in the ground, a place most settlers would have avoided as being too sloped for a proper house. For Hiram, the slope was the entire point. He was not digging a simple root cellar. He was performing surgery on the land itself. First, he marked out a large rectangle, 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. This was to be the heart of his new system, a subterranean storage chamber. He and Seth spent the first week breaking the earth, a grueling task of pickaxe and spade. The topsoil gave way to dense, rocky clay. They worked in a steady rhythm, Hiram breaking the compacted ground, Seth shoveling the loosened earth into the wheelbarrow and hauling it away. The pile of excavated dirt grew into a small hill. Reuben, riding his horse along the valley trail, stopped and watched them. The hole was now 4 feet deep. "Hiram," he called out, a smirk on his face, "digging a grave for your ambition. You'll miss the entire trapping season." Hiram simply nodded a greeting and kept working. The nickname was born that day. Soon, others in the valley began to speak of Hiram's Folly, the great useless hole being dug by the grieving widower and the orphan boy. Hiram ignored them all. His focus was absolute, his actions methodical. Once the pit reached a depth of 8 feet, he began the second, more critical phase. He started digging a trench, 2 feet wide and a foot deeper than the pit itself. This was the drainage channel, the road for water that Master Wallace had described. It began at the base of the main pit and sloped gently but consistently away from it, running for over 100 feet until it terminated in the low-lying creek bed at the edge of his property. The digging of this trench was an act of obsessive precision. Hiram used string and stakes to ensure the gradient was perfect. A drop of 1 inch for every 10 feet of length, just enough for water to flow, but not so much as to cause erosion. With the excavation complete, the construction began. This was the part that truly baffled onlookers. He and Seth spent weeks hauling stones from the creek bed and the surrounding hills. They were not building a traditional mortared wall. Inside the main pit, Hiram first laid down a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel. On top of this, he carefully placed large, flat stones, leaving small gaps between them. This created a floor that was solid to walk on but completely permeable to water from below. Next came the walls. He began dry stacking stones, fitting them together like a puzzle, with no mortar to bind them. He built the walls a foot away from the earthen sides of the pit, creating a cavity between his stone lining and the surrounding clay. This was another hidden detail. The cavity, which he filled with more gravel and coarse rock, would act as a vertical drainage field, catching any water that seeped through the soil and directing it down to the permeable floor. Reuben visited again, this time dismounting to get a closer look. He peered into the massive stone-lined pit with its strange, deep trench leading away. "You've spent the entire summer building a rock-lined hole, Hiram. The winter meat will freeze solid in there, and the spring damp will rot it anyway. You've broken your back for nothing." "The stone will draw the cold, it's true," Hiram replied calmly, hoisting another rock into place. but it will also draw the water, and the water will have somewhere else to be. His voice was not defensive, it was the simple statement of a man who has solved a difficult equation. This quiet confidence, more than the digging itself, seemed to enrage Reuben, who saw it as the height of arrogant foolishness. He mounted his horse and rode off, shaking his head. Hiram and Seth persisted, their world shrinking to the pit, the stones, and the rhythmic scrape of the shovel. As they worked, Hiram explained the principles to the boy. "The water wants to get into the cellar," he said, pointing at the earthen wall. "So we let it. We invite it in. But we give it this gravel path to follow, down to the floor." He then pointed to the deep drainage trench. "And the floor is the entrance to a highway. The water will always choose the easy road." Seth, who had started the work simply for a meal, was now a captivated student. He saw the logic, the simple genius of redirecting a force rather than trying to block it. The final piece of the engineering was the most subtle. After filling the main drainage trench with graduated layers of rock, large boulders at the bottom, smaller stones in the middle, gravel on top, Hiram did not simply cover it with dirt. He laid down a thick layer of the stickiest clay he could find, packing it down to create an impermeable cap. Well, this would prevent the fine silt and mud of the surface thaw from washing down and clogging the carefully constructed channel below. The system was designed to manage subsurface water, not the surface runoff. It was a detail no casual observer would ever see, but it was crucial to its long-term function. They built heavy wooden stairs down into the chamber and framed a roof of thick, hand-hewn timbers, which they covered with sod. Finally, they constructed a massive, angled door of double-layered planks, designed to sit flush with the slope of the ground and shed water naturally. Hiram named it the bog cache. It was not a cellar. A cellar was a hole that fought the earth. The cache was a structure that cooperated with it. They finished their work in late October, just as the first cold rains of autumn began to fall, a prelude to the coming winter. The air grew crisp, and the leaves of the aspens turned a brilliant, trembling gold. While other men were hastily patching their cabins and bringing in the last of their harvest, Hiram and Seth were stocking their new creation. The bog cache was larger and far more robust than any root cellar. They filled it not just with vegetables, but with barrels of salted meat, sacks of flour, and most importantly, an entire season's worth of dry, split firewood stacked neatly against the dry, stacked stone walls. The timing of its completion was perfect. It was as if the land itself wanted to provide a test. No sooner had they latched the heavy door for the first time than the autumn sky turned a bruised purple and opened up. For a week, a cold, relentless rain fell. It was not a violent storm, but a steady, saturating downpour that turned the valley floor into a familiar, soft sponge. It was a miniature version of the spring thaw, a perfect trial run for Hiram's system. Other settlers grumbled. Their woodpiles, not yet protected by a blanket of snow, grew damp. The ground around their cabins softened, and the familiar chill of the damp earth began to creep into their homes. It was a miserable, uncomfortable week, a taste of the hardship to come. On the 5th day of the rain, Seth looked at Hiram, his anxiety plain. "Is it working?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. He had helped build it, he had understood the theory, but the reality of its success or failure was now hidden beneath the ground. Hiram said nothing. He lit a lantern, its yellow flame a small point of courage against the gray afternoon. He walked to the slanted door of the cache, the ground around it firm under his boots. He lifted the heavy iron latch and pulled the door open. A gust of cool, clean air, smelling of stone and dry wood, washed over them. He descended the stone steps, Seth following close behind, his eyes wide. The proof of concept was absolute and immediate. The stone floor was perfectly dry. The walls, cool to the touch, showed no signs of moisture. The air was chilly, but it was a dry, subterranean cold, not the damp, life-sapping chill of a conventional cellar. Most telling of all was the sound. Faintly from beyond the stone walls they could hear it, a quiet, constant trickling. It was the sound of water, the enemy, moving through the gravel-filled cavity and into the drainage trench, being harmlessly guided away on its underground highway. Hiram ran his hand over a stack of firewood. It was bone dry, ready to burst into flame. He picked up a potato from a bin. Its skin was dusty and dry. The system worked. It worked perfectly. Seth let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He looked at Hiram with a new kind of reverence. It was one thing to see a man dig a hole. It was another to see him conquer a fundamental law of nature on the frontier. Hiram felt a quiet, profound sense of vindication. It was not triumphant, but a deep, somber satisfaction. The grief for Mary was still there, a hollow space in his chest, but now it was joined by the solid certainty that no one in his house would ever be threatened by the damp again. This initial success, however, did little to sway the opinion of the community. They saw smoke rising from Hiram's chimney and assumed he was burning through his winter fuel at a foolish rate. Reuben, passing by, saw the dry patch of ground around Hiram's cabin as a strange fluke of the land. "He built on a gravel bed by dumb luck," he told his wife. "He'll pay for it when the real cold comes, having wasted his summer on that rock pile." The sight of Hiram's comfortable home did not inspire curiosity, but resentment. It was seen as an extravagance, a deviation from the shared hardship that bonded the community. The dry wood was a sign of wastefulness, not engineering. The lingering skepticism was a wall as solid as any stone, and Hiram made no effort to breach it. He knew the final test was still to come, a test that could not be argued with. Winter arrived with a vengeance. The snows began in November and did not stop. Storm after storm rolled through the valley, burying the landscape under a deeper blanket of white than even the oldest timers could recall. By February, the snow lay 8 feet deep on the level ground, and the cabins were little more than mounds of white with smoking chimneys connected by deep trenches dug for paths. It was a brutal, isolating winter, one that tested the limits of every family's preparation. Then, in the last week of the month, the weather turned. An unnatural warmth bled into the air. A powerful Chinook wind, born on the far side of the great mountains, swept down into the valley. It was not a gentle thaw. It was a violent, atmospheric assault. The temperature climbed 40 degrees in a single day. The superstorm of melt began. An entire winter's worth of accumulated snow, a massive reservoir of frozen water, was released in less than 72 hours. The valley, which had been a world of solid white, transformed into a liquid nightmare. The frozen ground, insulated by the deep snow, could not absorb the deluge. Rivers of ice-cold water carved channels through the snowpack, and the valley floor became a churning, moving lake of slush, mud, and debris. It was the thaw of Hiram's memory, but magnified tenfold. It was a legendary event, the kind of disaster that would be spoken of for generations. And across the valley, the conventional wisdom of the frontier began to fail, catastrophically. The systemic failure was total. Cabins built on flat ground, like Reuben's, were the first to suffer. The water rose around them, not in inches, but in feet. The carefully packed mud and moss chinking between the base logs became saturated and washed away, opening gaps for the freezing water to pour directly into the homes. Floors became a slick, shallow pool of frigid mud. Families huddled on tables and chairs, their feet lifted out of the encroaching filth. Root cellars, the community's lifeline, were universally destroyed. The immense hydrostatic pressure of the saturated ground collapsed the earthen walls of the simple pits. Trapdoors were forced open from below by rising water. A winter's worth of food, the margin between survival and starvation, was wiped out in a single afternoon, turning into a putrid slurry. The greatest danger, as Hiram knew all too well, was the loss of fuel. Woodpiles, stacked on low ground near the cabins, were inundated. The bottom half of every stack was submerged in freezing water, while the top half was pelted by the wind-driven, sleety rain. The wood became a useless, sodden mass. Fires dwindled in hearth after hearth. The pervasive, bone-deep cold of the water was now inside the cabins, and there was no fuel to fight it. A child in a neighboring cabin developed a hacking cough, the same sound that haunted Hiram's memories. Panic began to set in. At Reuben's cabin, the situation was dire. The water on his floor was ankle-deep. His wife and 2 small children were huddled on their beds, wrapped in every blanket they owned, their faces pale with cold. The fire was little more than a pile of hissing, steaming coals. Reuben, his face a mask of grim desperation, knew he had to reach his woodpile. He could see it from his window, a dark mound 100 feet away, an island in a sea of brown water. He plunged out the door, the freezing water and mud instantly sucking at his legs. He took 2 steps and sank to his knees. He pushed forward, the thick, icy muck acting like a powerful anesthetic, numbing his legs. 10 feet from the door, he stumbled and fell, sinking to his waist. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath and his strength. He tried to pull himself out, but the mud held him fast. He was trapped, freezing to death only yards from his own home, his family watching in horror from the window. From his own cabin, Hiram saw it all. His home was an ark of stability. The ground around it was dry and solid. The bog cache was performing its function perfectly, its hidden drainage trench working at full capacity, silently channeling thousands of gallons of water away from the foundation. Inside, the air was warm, the fire roaring with dry oak that he had fetched that morning with a casual walk down a flight of dry stone steps. He saw Reuben fall, saw his desperate, failing struggle. There was no hesitation. "Seth, the planks," he ordered. They had several long, thick planks stored in the cache for just such a purpose. Together, they carried one to the edge of Hiram's dry island. They shoved it out over the mud, creating a makeshift bridge. Hiram crawled across it, the plank sinking slightly under his weight, and extended a hand to the freezing, exhausted Reuben. "Take my hand," he said, his voice calm and steady. With Seth pulling from the cabin side, Hiram dragged Reuben from the mud's grasp and back onto the solid ground of his own property. He and Seth helped the shivering, mud-caked man inside. Then, without a word, they went back out, laid more planks, and navigated the treacherous path to Reuben's cabin to retrieve his wife and children. They brought the terrified family across the bridge of planks from their world of cold and despair into Hiram's oasis of warmth and safety. The moment of absolute vindication was quiet but overwhelming. Reuben, wrapped in a dry blanket and sitting before a blazing fire, watched in stunned silence. His children, their shivering finally subsiding, drank hot broth. The contrast was absolute. His own home, built with the same knowledge and care as every other on the frontier, was an uninhabitable wreck. Hiram's home, the subject of his ridicule, was a fortress of comfort and security. The true revelation came when Hiram noticed the woodbox was getting low. He casually stood up, lifted a small ring pull on a trap door in the floor that Reuben had never noticed, and descended a short flight of steps. He was gone for a moment, and then reappeared, his arms laden with perfectly dry, clean firewood, which he added to the fire. The flames leapt and roared in response. Reuben stared at the open trap door. He could feel the cool, dry air rising from it. He could hear a faint, rhythmic gurgling sound from somewhere below. It was the sound of the system working, the sound of the water being tamed. He finally understood. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a fluke. It was a design. He looked at the roaring fire, at his warm children, at the quiet, methodical man who had just saved his life. The derisive name he had coined, Hiram's Folly, echoed in his mind, a testament to his own monumental ignorance. The Great Thaw lasted for 5 days. When the water finally receded and the ground began to firm, the valley was a scene of devastation. Several cabins were damaged beyond repair. Most families had lost their entire winter food stores. The community was shaken, humbled by the scale of the failure. A week later, a figure appeared at Hiram's door. It was Reuben. He stood with his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the ground. He did not speak for a long moment. "Hiram," he finally began, his voice low and strained. "I was wrong. I was a fool." He looked up, his eyes meeting Hiram's. "I can't go through that again. My family, we almost didn't make it. Can you show me how you did that? I'll pay. I'll work for you for a year." The request was a complete surrender, a humbling admission from the community's primary skeptic that his entire worldview had been flawed. Hiram looked at the man who had mocked him, who had led the chorus of ridicule. He saw no triumph in Reuben's humiliation, only the shared memory of fear and loss. "There's no payment," Hiram said, his voice even. "And you won't work for me. You'll work for yourself. I'll show you." His motivation had never been recognition or reward. It was the prevention of another tragedy, the silencing of another cough in a cold, damp room. He would share his knowledge freely, completely. That summer, the valley was filled with the sounds of digging and the clatter of stone. Hiram, with Seth at his side, moved from homestead to homestead teaching. He didn't just give instructions, he explained the principles. He taught them how to read the slope of their own land, how to find the natural paths for drainage. He showed them how to lay the permeable floor, how to dry stack the walls, and most importantly, how to engineer the precise, gentle slope of the main drainage trench. Reuben was his most dedicated student, his labor fueled by the fresh memory of his family's terror. He excavated his old, collapsed root cellar, making it wider and deeper, and dug a long trench toward the creek, his movements precise and determined. Others followed suit. The project that had been Hiram's Folly was now simply called a proper cache, or the new way. It became the standard. The local adoption was swift and total, driven not by a government decree or a new invention for sale, but by the simple, powerful proof of its success. As they worked, slight variations emerged. One man, whose land was mostly clay, found that using a thicker bed of sand beneath his gravel layer improved the flow. Another, who lived farther from the creek, dug his drainage trench into a deep, dry well filled with rocks, creating a large sump for the water to collect and slowly dissipate. The core principles remained, but the innovation was being adapted, personalized to the unique geology of each property. It was becoming a living piece of communal knowledge. The following year, a traveling builder named Jackson passed through the valley on his way to the new territories in the west, where settlements were just beginning to spring up. He was a practical man, a collector of techniques and tricks of the trade. He stopped for the night at Reuben's homestead and was astounded by what he saw. Reuben's cabin, now rebuilt on a raised stone foundation, was connected by a covered walkway to a large, sod-roofed structure. Reuben proudly gave him a tour, taking a lantern down into the cool, dry expanse of his bog cache. He showed Jackson the stone floor, the dry, stacked walls, and explained the unseen drainage trench. "The water flows right under us," Reuben explained with the confidence of a seasoned expert. "The whole world can be a swamp, but in here, it's always dry." Jackson, who had seen dozens of frontier settlements struggle with rot and damp, recognized the simple genius of the system immediately. "Who invented this?" Jackson asked, running his hand over the perfectly dry stone. "I've never seen anything like it," Reuben pointed across the valley. "Man named Hiram. He figured it out after he lost his wife to the damp." Jackson spent the next week in the valley. He didn't spend it with Reuben. He went to the source. He sat with Hiram for 3 days, sketching the design in a worn, leather-bound notebook. Hiram answered every question, drawing diagrams in the dirt, explaining the importance of the gradient, the clay cap, the gravel backfill. He gave away his intellectual property without a second thought. Jackson left the valley with the plans for the bog cache tucked safely in his saddlebags. He carried the idea west into the burgeoning settlements of the Wyoming and Montana territories. As he taught the method to new settlers, he simplified the name. He called it the mountain drainage method. He was a builder, not a historian, and Hiram's name was an unnecessary detail. The story of Mary was lost, the personal tragedy at its core fading with every mile Jackson traveled. Within a decade, the innovation had been fully anonymized. In settlers' guides and pamphlets distributed back east, crude diagrams appeared showing a thaw cellar, or more commonly, a bog cache. The name, born of Hiram's specific design, had stuck, but its origin was completely obscured. It was presented as a piece of established frontier wisdom, a clever trick for building on wet ground. The name Hiram was never mentioned. His innovation had become common sense, its creation attributed to the anonymous collective ingenuity of the mountain man. Years turned into decades. The valley settled and grew. The rough-hewn cabins were replaced by frame houses, but the fundamental architecture of the land remained. Every home, old and new, was built upon the principles Hiram had established. The unseen network of drainage trenches and stone-lined caches formed a hidden foundation for the community's prosperity and safety. Hiram grew old. He continued to live in his small cabin, with Seth living nearby with a family of his own. He was a quiet, respected figure, known as a skilled trapper and a man of few words. No one spoke of him as an innovator. The children who grew up playing on the dry ground around their homes had no idea that their safety was owed to him. The dramatic story of the Great Thaw and his singular, successful cabin had faded into a vague local legend. Hiram died peacefully in his sleep one autumn night, an old man whose life's great work was buried beneath the feet of his neighbors. His gravestone, carved by Seth, was simple and stark, reflecting the man he was. It read, Hiram, 1798-1871, husband, trapper. There was no mention of his engineering, no hint of the revolution he had started. His legacy was not written in stone, but in the absence of tragedy. It was measured in the uncounted number of children who did not catch a fatal chill, in the families who did not face starvation because their food was secure, in the simple, profound comfort of a warm fire on a cold, wet night. Later generations, digging foundations for new barns or wells, would sometimes unearth the old systems. They would find the carefully laid stones of a drainage trench still clear and functional after a century, and marvel at the foresight of the old-timers. They saw it as the work of a wise, anonymous collective, a piece of folk knowledge passed down and perfected. They never knew it was the work of one man, driven by a singular grief. The innovation had become so ubiquitous that it was invisible, as fundamental and uncredited as the concept of a roof or a door. Long after Hiram was gone, another great thaw came to the valley, one that rivaled the legendary flood of '48. As the world outside turned to mud and water, a string of lights glowed from the windows of the homes scattered across the landscape. From each chimney, a confident plume of smoke rose into the damp air, each one a small, silent monument. They were islands of warmth and safety, secure on their foundations, protected by the unseen, forgotten genius of a quiet man who had looked at a tragedy and refused to accept it. A man who had taught the water a new way to travel, and, in doing so, had saved them all.